Alright, hello. For this guide, I'm going to be showing how to basically using NextJS front end authenticate to some backend API that's running on Google. So there's a couple aspects here. So these are both, so we have the backend Google VM and the front end Google VM, with the front end containing NextJS and the backend containing some API, that whatever API we want, right? The backend VPN here will be protected by Google authentication, so you'll get 403 if you're not authenticated. And the way that we're going to authenticate is Next.js. When the browser makes a request to the API, just the standard Next.js API that's built in, this is going to create an authentication token, which will allow us to send to the backend API, retrieve data, and return it back to the client. And in the API, we're going to be using Clerk.js as our, this is Clerk.js, it's an authentication provider. We'll be using this as our authentication mechanism. All right, let's get started. Okay, so here we have the backend setup. So I'm just going to run through a couple of things. This is just using the functions framework for Python because we're going to be deploying this as a cloud function. And so I had some logging here to assist with just visibility, I guess. And then we're going to get the authorization token. If there's none attached, we'll just return 403. And then if it is attached, we will extract the token from the header because this is what the token will look like. So we have the bearer and then space and then the token here. Except I'll just get rid of that there. So we'll extract that and then we're checking if it's equal to what we have set the authentication to be. If it's not equal to that, we'll just return 403. If it is, we'll just return some random text. So if I start this up here, you can see here as an environment variable, I'm just setting it to 123. And then once I run this, I'm just going to move this to the side here. And then this is Postman. Postman's really helpful for testing your APIs and stuff. So here's we can set an authorization here. But so if I set no auth here, we'll get user not authorized. And we can see here on the login on the right here that there's no authentication attached, right? So if I set this to bearer, and I set a different token, we'll still get that 403. But if I set it to exactly what we need, that's when we get the random text generated. So that's the backend overview. Okay, so now that we have the front end set up here, I'm just going to go over a couple of things. So we have Clerk installed, and we have a couple environment variables here that we need to be set. So we have the public PEM key. This is how we'll validate the session cookies. And so to add this, you'll add it to your environment variables file, sorry. But you need to replace the new lines with actual \n. So each one of these will be a \n. As you can see, I've done that here. A couple of other things, these two variables up here, you won't be able to boot the app without these installed. So make sure they're in your environment variables file. And then with the backend URL, we set this as an environment variable because we need it for the Google side of getting a metadata token. And then we have an environment dev, which I'll show later on. So I'm kind of assuming if you're watching this that you are a bit familiar with Clerk. I hope you are, it's really good. But so how I have Clerk set up is you just have the Clerk provider wrapping all your components basically. And then in terms of actual implementation, we have in this index file here. And so the Clerk provider allows you to use like this hook here to check if people are signed in and then grab the data once they're signed in. So this is all kind of boilerplate to make it look pretty, and to also sign in. You can see if we're not signed in, then we display a sign in button. If we are signed in, we present the user button. And then I have some utility functions here, healthy and get data. All these are doing getting an API endpoint from NextJS API server. So you can see here the healthy one is open to anyone. Anyone can invoke this. And then we have a get data endpoint, which will call our backend, and you need to be authenticated to do that. So a couple things we're sending here is, first of all, on the client side, like in the browser, we're just going to check if we're signed in. If not, then we won't waste our time. We'll just present the error and return. If we are, we're just going to provide the user ID as a query parameter, and then set the output from the call. So a couple more things. I'll just show you the healthy endpoint. You can see here there's no authentication. Anyone can hit it. Just remove that. And then the data endpoint is a bit more involved. Obviously in a real app you would have this all sectioned out nicely. But so this is the actual API endpoint here. And so I'm just going to walk through a couple of things we're doing. The user ID we're grabbing from the query parameter that we set on the browser side. If this isn't attached, just return forbidden. This is a TypeScript little thingamajig. And then we're doing a couple of things. So this function is validating that the user is requesting data for their user, basically. So you can't request data for someone that isn't you. And if not, we'll just return that. And then once we validate that they are who they say they are, we will grab a token from the Google metadata server. And then finally, once we've done that, we can get data from the backend API. So going from the top here, this validate clerk JWT function it works using cookies on the browser side. So we'll grab those cookies, and then we're going to grab the clerk public PEM, which is this down here. And then so we're going to do a couple checks here. If there's no session, obviously we'll turn false. And then if there is, sorry, I lost my train of thought, but this JWT package will just validate that, or it actually decodes JWT using the public key. And then it just returns the decoded JWT if it's all good to go, otherwise return false. And then going down the train further, this client can request. So we're simply here checking that the user ID stored in the cookie is equal to what the request is requesting for. So you can't request for other people. And then once that's finally done, so these are handled by this, and then going down to the custom Axios is we're getting the token, we create this custom Axios so the header is always set, and then we're just returning that instance. So to get the token is done through this function here. And then the reason we have this here, it's going back to why I set this env to dev here. And that is because when we're testing locally, obviously we don't have access to this endpoint here. So we're just going to return the dummy token. And then, but if we are running on Google, we will get that token and just return it. A couple more things, because the backend, like they're both going to be running on Google eventually. So we're no longer going to handle authentication from the backend API because it's already handled by Google. So in that case, we're just going to return no matter what. So I think that's all the spiel. Let's start this up. So now we have the backend and front end running here. And that is visible once this loads here. So we have a couple of utility functions as I was calling before. So this is a healthy endpoint. This is the same result as that there. And if I were to put this into Postman, we'll get the same result. But then the call data API endpoint, obviously we have to authenticate. So that's why, because we're not logged in, we're getting that error message. So let's go ahead and log in. This here is our user ID. I'm just displaying it here for convenience basically. But you can see now I'm able to call the endpoint on the backend. And so we can actually just do this via API as well if we're running on the same browser. So if I set that as a query parameter, whoops, we're still getting that result. And then, so as I said before, we can only request for our own user. So if I just add something random here, we'll get the forbidden message. And then one more thing, if you do it from like another browser, you're obviously gonna get that that forbidden error message. And same thing for like Postman, right? Cool, so I think this is ready to deploy to Google. Okay, so now that I've deployed the backend and front end, the only changes I made were in the environment variables file. I changed the backend URL to what it actually is when it's deployed, and I changed the environment to prod so that we're actually getting that token every time. And then, so this is on the left here, this is the backend running right now. And you can see here, this is the trigger of the backend. If you try and invoke it directly, you'll get that 403 forbidden error because you have to invoke it through the front end. And then, so this is the front end. I'm just running it as a cloud run because I've containerized this NextJS app, and I've allowed no authentication. So anyone can load this URL right now. And then, so the behavior is basically the same, right? Like we're running on the cloud right now. Okay. And then you can see we're actually fetching it there. And then this may take a second to update, but we will see that it's getting invoked. These are the logs for the Cloud Run app for NextJS. And as you can see here, each time we're making a request, we're getting that token from the metadata. There's a couple more things I'll show. This is probably painfully obvious, but obviously the behavior is the same. Like so you can see there we can only search for ourselves, and then like in another browser we're going to get that forbidden there. Cool. Okay, so that's basically the demo there. Thanks for watching. I hope this is helpful. So just in summary, this is the front end running as a VM. For our particular case, we just did a Cloud Run app. And then within it, on the browser side, we're authenticated using Clerk.js. It's great. I definitely recommend you try it out. They have a really generous free tier. And then so through the API essentially becomes an authentication proxy, which is then able to go to the backend API, which is another Google VM. And in our example, we just did a Cloud Run endpoint for that. Cool. Yeah, that's about it. If you want to see like a real implementation of this is the website I made called Osiris. It's just like a stock market visualization tool. It lets you find like insights, but like the example I showed does all of what I just demonstrated in this tutorial. So yeah, little plug at the end. I think this is dope. You should check it out. But yeah, that's about it. Thank you for watching. Any feedback, I would love to hear it. This is the first time I've ever done this. So yeah, cheers.